Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak podcast. Good morning. It's Monday the 15th of December. I'm Caroline Hepker in London.
And I'm Stephen Carroll in Brussels. Coming up today, Australia's deadliest terror attack. At least 15 are killed and one gunman dies as the Jewish community is targeted on Bondi Beach.
Italy's Giorgia Meloni says Trump's national security strategy lays bare Europe's dependence on the US for defence.
Plus, why a pioneer of private equity is facing his most difficult trade yet.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Australia's government says it will consider toughening gun laws after a father and his son killed 15 people in the deadliest terror attack in the country's history. The mass shooting at a Jewish community celebration of Hanukkah on Sydney's Bondi Beach also left dozens injured. A bystander who rushed and disarmed one of the attackers has won praise from leaders around the world. Speaking at a press conference, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese described the attack as an act of evil anti-Semitism.
What we saw yesterday was an act of pure evil, an act of anti-Semitism in an iconic Australian location, Bondi Beach, that is associated with joy, and it is forever tarnished by what has occurred.
Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese speaking there as police said the suspected shooters are a 50-year-old and a 24-year-old from the city's western suburbs. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation have named the gunman as Naveed Akram, who remains in hospital, and his father Sajid, who was killed. 3 active improvised explosive devices were also found at the scene and rendered safe by police.
Reacting to the attack, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sought to link the shooting to Australia's support for a Palestinian state. In September, Australia joined the UK, Canada and others in formally recognising a Palestinian state, joining a growing global consensus backing a two-state solution in the region. Netanyahu says he wrote to the Australian Prime Minister 4 months ago.
It pours fuel on the anti-Semitic fire. It encourages the Jew hatred now stalking your streets. Anti-Semitism is a cancer. It spreads when leaders stay silent and you must replace weakness with action.
That was the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking. Several synagogues in Australia, along with Jewish businesses and homeowners, have been targeted following the outbreak of war in Gaza, triggered by Hamas's attack on Israel on October the 7th, 2023.
European leaders are talking about ending their reliance on the United States for defence as they try to negotiate a response to US President Donald Trump's peace plan for Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelenskiy has signalled that Kyiv could accept security guarantees instead of NATO membership after talks in Berlin this weekend. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz hosted the talks. Over the weekend, he told a political rally that Europe needs to stand on its own.
The decades of the Pax Americana are largely over for us in Europe and for us in Germany as well. It no longer exists as we knew it, and nostalgia doesn't help either. And I would be one of the last people who would not like to indulge in this nostalgia, but it's no use. That's the way it is. The Americans are now very, very tough in pursuing their own interests, and that can mean only one thing, that we now have to pursue our own interests too.
As Germany's Chancellor speaking through a translator, Russia has said it would probably reject all the proposals from Ukraine and Europe, throwing doubt on whether Trump's push to end the nearly 4-year war could succeed. European and NATO leaders are set to join Zelensky later for a summit on how to work with the US to secure a peace deal with Russia.
Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni says the new US national security strategy is a wake-up call for Europe. Her remarks come after a document published by the Trump White House last week outlining the plans blamed EU policy for tilting the region towards, quote, civilizational erasure. Speaking at a festival organised by her Brothers of Italy party, Meloni criticised the bloc's approach to defence.
Che dire? Buongiorno, Europa.
What can I say?
Buongiorno.
Good morning, Europe.
Good morning. We have contracted out our security to the US for 80 years, thinking this day would never come. But most importantly, pretending this was free. There was a price.
Giorgia Meloni there speaking in Rome yesterday, her words spoken via a translator. This week, Europe faces two crucial deadlines. One, to fund Ukraine's fight against Russia without help from Washington, and the other to show its move away from US supply lines by striking up a trade deal with South America. Both come after US President Donald Trump's warnings that many EU leaders aren't grasping the risk of another world war.
The head of Britain's armed forces says the whole nation needs to become more resilient and prioritise industry and infrastructure to deter the growing threat from Russia. In a speech later today, the UK Chief of Defence Staff Richard Knighton will warn the price of peace is increasing as Russia attempts to divide and destroy NATO. Knighton, who took up the post in September, adds the current security situation is the worst he's seen in his nearly 30-year career.
And lastly, Bank of England policymakers are expected to cut interest rates by 25 basis points when they meet later this week. The move would bring the central bank's benchmark rate to 3.75%, close to what some measures suggest is Britain's neutral rate. Meanwhile, salary growth for the country's lowest paid workers is slowing down. Bloomberg's Siwa Adebayo has the story.
A worsening job market means employees at the bottom end of the pay scale have little bargaining power. They're a section of the workforce that historically have proven resistant to Bank of England inflation-fighting efforts. But now new data shows the effects are taking hold. Advertised salaries for low-wage jobs have posted their first moderation since April, according to job search site Indeed. A separate report from the Recruitment and Employment Confederation showed the number of active vacancies declined 11.2% in November on a monthly basis, with hiring for Christmas jobs like delivery drivers or postal workers down on last year's levels. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
Those are some of our top stories. Just wanted to mention another piece, though, that we've been reading this morning about the persuasive power of AI. This from our opinion columnist, Parmi Olsen, who's been writing about a study showing that the newest models are getting better at convincing people, but sometimes at the expense of the truth. This study from Oxford University and London School of Economics shows that while large language models can be very effective in convincing people of things, when they're prompted to overwhelm users with information, the factual accuracy often declines. And that, Parmi says, is something that we should be worried about.
Yeah, look, I feel like her story is pointing to a new kind of advertising, sort of advertising on steroids, but you might not even know what people are sort of trying to sell you. AI chatbots can persuade people. We know that. They can do that for good, like addressing conspiracy theories. Some studies have shown that. But perhaps they can more easily maybe even be used for ill, maybe not via ChatGPT itself, but Parmi points to these chatbots that people can use on their own websites, on social media, maybe to push these points.
Yeah, look, it's a fascinating, I suppose, aspect of the AI rollout that we're getting to grips with still. And she concludes that it really is up to the operators of the big large language models, the likes of OpenAI, to make sure that their platforms aren't being used for sort of distorting the political discourse as well. An interesting piece worth reading this morning, bloomberg.com/opinion.
Now, I want to update you on the markets briefly this week. This is the last full trading week of 2025. We get the November jobs report out on Tuesday, so that will be a big point with a lot of decisions on central banks to think about this week. In terms of stock futures right now, it's quite positive this Monday. US Stoxx 50 futures up 0.3, S&P and Nasdaq E-minis also are higher this week. But remember, those two gauges in the US retreated more than 1% on Friday, so it's still been volatile, and we had very weak retail sales figures for China amongst the slew of data out of China today. Sales only rose 1.3% in November, the slowest figures on record outside of the pandemic. So you have the MSCI China index down 1.4% this morning. In terms of bond yields, 4.18 for US yields, little movement there. Oil prices, gold and Bitcoin are all headed higher. Those are the markets.
In a moment, we'll bring you a story from the world of private equity and why a pioneer in the sector is facing his most difficult trade yet. But I wanted to bring you more on our top story this morning. First, the attack on Sunday on Bondi Beach in Sydney, the massacre marking the deadliest terror attack in Australia's history. Our Australia Economy and Government editor, Mike Heath, joins us now for more from Sydney. Mike, thanks for being with us. Just talk to us about what's been happening in the country over the past 2 days. What has it been like in Australia seeing this attack, but also the criticism that's come from Israel's Prime Minister?
It's basically been surreal. You know, this is the sort of thing that happens in other countries where we're at the end of the world and usually a long, long way from these problems. And for it to happen at Bondi Beach, and it's sort of like, you know, in Australia, that's a meeting spot, a melting spot for cultures from all over the world. Everyone who comes to Australia goes to that beach. It was a really hot, really warm day. And so the beach was packed. Then you had the Jewish community who were having the first day of Hanukkah celebration, which they do on an annual basis. So it sort of has just come absolutely out of nowhere. I mean, it's just the sort of thing we'd normally read about somewhere else. So quite surreal. And then we've sort of had Prime Minister Netanyahu with some fairly strident comments. I mean, he's definitely not backwards and going forwards, and he has a point to some extent that when you look back at the incidents and what had been building, there was a problem going on there. And I think that a lot of people were sort of perhaps a bit too focused on, you know, this is to do with the conflict in Gaza and people are upset about civilian casualties, but there was a definite underlying theme of anti-Semitism there and growing. And, just the nature of how these things tend to unfold, somebody just does something really, really crazy. And really, that's the only way you can describe it, because it's just horrible. It's just not something I've seen before.
Yeah, very devastating. Well, what more do we know about the perpetrators, the father and son gunmen? It also looks like this incident is prompting discussion about policy change, including on Australian gun control.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, the police aren't releasing a huge amount of information on them in terms of their motivations and that sort of thing. What we do know, as you said, it's a father and son. The father was killed in a firefight. The son is injured and in hospital. The son had been born in Australia. The father had come on a visiting visa and then had a spousal visa and had been running on that back and forth from going overseas. There's not a lot of detail other than the father had half a dozen licensed weapons, and this is sort of some of the question that's been going on. About 30 years ago, we had a terrible massacre here in Tasmania by a mentally unstable person, and Australia introduced very strict gun laws, and just this idea that someone would turn up, or a couple of men would turn up with these rifles and be able to just start shooting people. And there's been a lot of reports of criminal gun violence and that sort of thing. It's really shone the spotlight on what the situation is with guns. So there's the meeting of the federal government and state governments. I think that began about an hour ago. And what they're talking about there is being able to potentially revoke people's licences if there's any suspicions about them, to go and keep to keep it as an ongoing process, looking at licences rather than you've got it, you're fine to keep going with it. But we'll get more information on that in probably the next hour or two.
OK, Mike, thanks very much for joining us. That's Mike Heath there in Sydney, our Economy and Government editor. Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Daybreak Europe coming up after this.
Now for a story about finance. Collar Capital has become one of the most valuable niche finance firms in the City of London, driven by its founder, Jeremy Collar. His pioneering in secondaries, a strategy of helping investors exit unwanted stakes in private equity funds, has created a booming industry, and some investors are looking beyond its visionary founders. Our leveraged finance reporter, Kat Hidalgo, joins us now for more. Tell us more about this business and the investment strategy that Collar's become known for.
Yeah, and so Jeremy Collar is a character, to be sure, a well-known figure in the private equity world. He owns one of the world's early secondaries firms, Collar Capital. So secondaries is the strategy where firms, investors can buy and sell stakes in private equity firms. So really much the same way that you'd think about another kind of secondaries market, say in equities. It's really booming, this this market, secondaries, especially in the kind of difficult M&A environment. You're seeing a lot more investors needing to sell out of private equity firms to get a bit more capital in. And that's where Jeremy Coller's firm comes in. He will buy a lot of those stakes. So the firm itself is very exciting. We think it's valued at about 3.5 billion, and it's taking on minority investors, for example, in the form of State Street. The story kind of follows Jeremy Coller and his journey to letting go of the firm that he's given his name to, because visionary founders are no shock to the private equity world, but this is one that's really held on for 30 years.
So what does the future of this industry look like at the moment? We're talking about huge growth, but also that's casting questions over Collar and his firm.
Yeah, so the industry is getting bigger and bigger. We think it's going to be about 210 billion this year. The thing about this particular firm is that as the industry has professionalised and disintermediated and become much more important, it's changed, and investors' views of Jeremy have changed as well, I guess, over time. And we see that kind of with performance of his funds doing not quite as well as some of his competitors. So, Jeremy Coller even talks himself about how early on in the industry's history, he would, the approach to secondaries would be, why buy someone else's trash? And that's all changed now.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.